área. Atenção, ajeitando o peito Pelé. Pintou o adversário, vai marcar, atirou. Gol! Uma beleza de gol! Gol do Brasil, Pelé!
Hello everyone and welcome to Podium Cast, your sports scientist podcast. Today, it's my pleasure to interview Thabata Castelo Branco Teles, a strong Brazilian woman that fights for good practice in science and sport psychology. But she also has fought in many different tatamis worldwide. Her main aim, however, was always the same: to research martial arts and Afro-Brazilian martial arts, for instance, Capoeira and Brazilian Karate. Her scientific career crossed many borders, with time spent in France at Université Paris-Est-Marne-la-Valée. I think this is a French guy. We'll hear this, he will just start to laugh right now. And the Institut de Sciences du Sport-Santé de Paris, Université Paris-Descartes in Paris. She also spent time in Canada at McGill University, as well in Greece at the University of Thessaly. Intensively, she has experienced practical exchange in South Korea and Japan. Currently, she's a postdoc at the University of São Paulo, but since last year, she is in Portugal as a part of additional scientific exchange at the University of Portugal. She's also president of ABRAPESP, Brazilian Association of Sport Psychology. She loves surf, she speaks and understands 6 languages. My dear Thabata, how are you?
I'm great. After this introduction, I'm surprised. Yes, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I think it's a very nice opportunity for us to share a little bit about our research projects and through the backstage process, which is even more interesting because usually we talk about the papers, we have some questions about what we see when we write, but there's a whole history behind it, and sometimes we don't tell this history, how we get there. And in my case, it's all intertwined because I practice a lot of different martial arts and combat sports. So, for example, karate, I've practiced for many years, and capoeira, just a few classes. But usually I started to do this kind of research with interviews and observations, and now I'm doing an immersion process in my postdoc. So now with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example, but I also practice, as I said, different fights. So yeah, that's what I was saying. That's very interesting when you talk about these histories that sometimes we don't tell people, and that's even more interesting to know about the research when you know these stories behind it.
Yeah, just a remark. I remember one post that you made in Facebook, and then you wrote a long post talking about the history behind the paper. And this is exactly what I think, as you said, that is interesting, because normally when you think, oh, well, I'm a scientist, you are kind of oriented to talk about the results and sometimes about the method, but the story behind is actually, and the person behind, as you are now in focus, is for me really important. But again, thanks Thabata for being here. But today we also have the honor to receive Marius Kruscher, a PhD candidate at Institute for Clinical Neurosciences and Medicine Psychology. My first scientific friend in Germany and a passionate guy for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and former wrestling athlete. Marius, how are you?
Hey, Jose. Hi. Yeah, I'm great. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me this morning. I'm a late bird, so so I need to my pulse is still low and I'm a little bit sleepy, but we will get through, and I hope I can contribute and to your conversation, and yeah, to engage in a nice dialogue, and actually also to get to know Thabata and her motivations in in her sports science research.
Nice, nice. Be sure. I don't worry. I also just woke up, but the point is now we are here and we just live in the present. Let's go. Okay, Tabata, could you tell me a little bit more about the story behind the publication entitled Karate, Capoeira and MMA, a phenomenological approach to process of starting a fight? So, how did you come up with this idea to write this paper and why?
Well, first, this is a part of my PhD. And actually, when I started to ask some fighters to describe to me some fighting processes, at that time, I didn't know how I could organize for example, if I would be organizing in topics or related to each practice. At that time, I didn't know. But when I started to analyze the interviews, I realized that they divided into time when they started to describe me the fighting process, when they started to tell me about their experience. So every time they would say, okay, I start the fight doing this and that, and then I do this and that, and then I end the fight doing this and that. So this was the first time that I realized that I needed to divide into this timing process. So it was for example, in Brazil, I know that we don't have this kind of organization in every country, but in Brazil, when we're doing a PhD process, in the middle of the process, we have what we call a qualification process, when you show to the jury part of the research, and then you have some feedbacks and to improve to the defense part. And at that time, I divided to present to the jury in the process of starting the fight, the development of the fight, and then how we could end the fight.
I see.
To the thesis, then I changed. But at the time, it was nice for me to have this kind of view of the process. And then I started to present these parts of my thesis in some congresses. So in 2016, I presented in IMAX. It's a conference from the International Martial Arts and Combat Sports Scientific Association. And then when I presented this part of starting the fight, Professor Carlos Gutierrez, which is the editor-in-chief of RAMA, the Artes Marciales Asiáticas. And then he told me, that's a very interesting paper, there's a very interesting idea. I think you should do a paper to develop this discussion, and please submit to my journal. I would love to receive this kind of contribution. And then I started to improve the material to be able to publish. And there's another interesting part of this publication part, because it was only me and Cristiano Barreira, which is my supervisor, at that time my advisor, and it was the first time that I was trying to publish a paper in English.
Nice.
And in English, because usually, okay, I can talk, I can understand, I can present a paper in a conference, I can write some short text, but for the first time it was a whole paper. And then I received a lot of feedbacks, of negative feedbacks about the English part. And then later on, we started to work with Anu Vaitinen, which was the reviewer of the process. And then we changed everything. She wasn't the reviewer anymore. She would be into the paper with us because she was also interested in martial arts, combat sports. And then we submitted again with another reviewers to submit the paper and to improve not only the English part, because her contribution was also regarding to the phenomenology part and the martial arts, combat sports part, because we share the same interest in researching. So it's another interesting. I think I've never told anyone this part of the process, the backstage, but it's very important because for us, non-native English speakers, it's very hard to write in English and publish in English.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah. Well, as when I arrived in Germany, I faced this, and Marius, funnily, is a guy who can show the improvement phase. Well, I'm still improving because I just arrived in Germany speaking Portuguese, and now I speak 3 languages, and this Podium Cast is actually in 3 languages, and he can like tell you how the process is, not only to do science but also to connect with people in science, because they expect you to use the words that they use normally in the scientific community, but it can be a little bit frustrating if you don't do that. But this is a nice story, yeah. And then how was the process? How long did it take from the first submission until the end? Was it like a long process, like 1 year, or was even longer?
I don't remember. I was trying to find it right now because sometimes they write that in the paper. Yes, they wrote that. Okay, so it was, yeah, a year. It was received in November 2017.
Mm-hmm.
It was published in October 2018. So I had a year. It's another interesting story because people think that to publish papers is very fast, but it's never fast. So,
yeah. The things is like a
just
post in Facebook that you just click the publish button and then it pop ups. No, nice. Yeah, Tabata, I saw in this paper that it was kind of guided by interviews using the phenomenological approach. Could you tell our audience what actually phenomenological approach is?
Well, that's another interesting question because usually we see phenomenology very attached to qualitative research. So usually people say, oh, it's a kind of qualitative research, it's a tool for quality. Okay, but my point is, and this is very linked to the time I spent in France. This was very important to me because I work with French phenomenology. So I spent half of my PhD into a philosophy department studying French phenomenology. And we need to say that over and over again, that phenomenology is a branch of philosophy. So first of all, it's a way of doing philosophy. It's an attitude, it's some positions that you assume when you are researching something, when you are looking something. So that's the main point to start with, because for example, I'm a psychologist, and sometimes in the psychology field, people say that it's okay, a psychological approach. No, if you read the text of phenomenology, you never find ways to, for example, work in a clinic with a patient. You won't find it, but it will be helpful. And at the same time, you won't find direct contributions to qualitative research, but you can be inspired by phenomenology to do interviews, for example. But you won't find in phenomenology text direct ways to do interviews or whatsoever. And sometimes I like to poke people saying that, okay, and what if we use phenomenology to do quantitative research? I'm not a quantitative researcher, but for example, now in my postdoc, I'm starting to do it because I'm working with some items to investigate the performance process, and sometimes we must put numbers. And I'm still doing phenomenology because the way that I reach this item, for example, is a phenomenological process. So for me, if you're doing a phenomenological research, you're doing a phenomenological research, and then you can use this kind of what I like to call, it's not my word, okay, it's from the Merleau-Ponty, as an attitude, that phenomenology is an attitude. And later on, I can put it in a qualitative research process or in a quantitative research process. So in this case, I used it to help me with the interviews, which is the most used if you go into the literature in the field, you'll find that most of the papers are using phenomenology to interview, which is not a problem at all. But the problem is to think that that's the only way to use or to work with phenomenology in researching.
I see. Yeah, can you give our audience an example how the interview goes? So like it's a free interview that you just ask someone, how do you feel? And then it starts from that, or you have a script that, can you just give them a kind of short idea what actually is the interview if we use this phenomenological approach?
Actually, it's very dynamic, because when you're talking about phenomenology, one thing that is very important is the idea of go to the things themselves. So we try to set aside what is not part of that experience to truly understand what that experience is. So when we're doing an interview, it was not an open interview. I had 3 questions. So which is to say that I needed to ask those 3 questions, but I could ask another questions if I had to, if I felt to, etc. When I'm telling this is very dynamic, is that is what Barreira likes to call a suspensive listening. That which is to say, when I'm listening to someone, when I'm making these questions, I try to set aside what I know from that subject. So for example, even if I practice karate for 10, 20 years, if I'm interviewing a karate practitioner, I try to set aside my experience my experience in karate, what I know that karate is, what I know people told me that karate is, because sometimes you're doing the 8th interview and sometimes you remember what the other guys told you, but you try to set that aside. But I like the idea that it's a suspensive listening and that it's very dynamic. Another backstage process is that we can never do it completely. So
what do you mean?
To set aside these topics, because we are humans. So when we are doing the interviews, we are trying to set aside all the time. Sometimes you are very into the interview, and sometimes you don't need to make a great effort to pay attention to what the person is saying. But sometimes the person tells you something that you already heard like 3 times, and you need to set that aside because you need to understand that experience at that moment.
I understand.
And then when you analyze, so it's different because you're gonna cross what people said to try to find what is common among these interviews. So that's when I'm saying that we have phases and we have some steps, and it's very dynamic because sometimes you need to set aside and sometimes you need to cross the interviews, and then you need to cross the interviews with the literature. So it depends on the phase you are in the whole process.
I understand. Really interesting. Yeah, Marius?
Yeah, is it correct then if I assume that it's more like it looks like more a free space, more like you're guiding, but you're giving the space for the interviewed person to express comprehensively what she or he thinks in all details, and you do not intervene to a very strict and clear red thread through the interview. You're careful to restrict them by their thinking, but you let the thinking process in this person going on, so you can get all the little details. Or is this like somehow this way?
Actually, I think it depends on your research question. It all depends on what you're looking for when you're doing the interview. Because in my case, I was trying to understand the experience of fighting karate and capoeira and MMA. That was my research question all the time. So I wouldn't be interested if those fighters started to tell me, for example, technical aspects or the historical aspects. So I needed to guide somehow to the experience. Okay, so when you're there with another person, how is that? That was my research question.
Yeah, funnily, exactly like this was the question that Marius did in his master, and I remember this clearly because I was one of his pilot participants, and he has done something in the similar way where he has used force plates, and the participants were on the force plate. And Marius, maybe you can tell better because you remember this better than me. But there was a kind of decision process and this feeling of initiation the fight.
Yeah, right. It was not qualitative. It was very quantitative, as far as I remember myself, because it's 6 years ago. But the idea was more or less that as a fighter, you'll learn specific habits, how to engage in a fighting situation, and then you're forced. You're standing on this force plate, and you get shown two very specific pictures. It was basically me trying to like an attacking movement, a wrestling attacking movement, like on kind of a video, and then also a defensive movement. And then basically what I did was just measure reaction times to look if fighters behave differently than non-fighters to certain color cues. And these color cues, that was my t-shirt on the video, indicating them if they also have to do an attacking movement or if they have to do a defense movement. And the idea was that the congruency, like there's a congruency effect for fighters, that if they see defense movement, they will be reluctant to do an attacking movement, but because it's missed energy. And other way around, if they see an attacking movement, they will do immediately the defense movement. But this is vague for a novice. He doesn't know, okay, this movement is threatening to me, so they will probably take less time. So it was very quantitative, not qualitative in this way. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, Tabata, going this direction, but a little bit further to Japan. You know, this year is a special year for us as a sports scientist. And what do you expect for the all martial arts and the Olympic Games in Japan? Do you expect to have more science involved, or do you have some inside information? Do you think about that will be always the same? Japan will win all the judo and karate maybe, and Brazilian will be like always good, but we never know. How do you have some information, or what do you expect about the Olympic Games in Japan?
Well, actually, interestingly, for women, judo, for Brazilian women, judo is our top medal modality. So most of the female medals in Brazil are from judo. So Brazil is a very strong country in judo, but it's a very competitive setting. So it's even saying that we have Japan and we have France, we have some other countries which are very strong in combat sports field. But actually, it's polemical. But I'm not so into the sportive model when I'm talking about martial arts and combat sports. And this is polemical because, for example, we have karate for the first time in the Olympics, and probably the only time, because to 2024 they have already announced that they won't have karate, but they will have a break dancing. So they changed. It was already announced. So that's a very interesting case, a case of one and only Olympic Games modality. But I honestly, I don't know if we're gonna have more science or not. In Brazil, things are a bit complicated right now. So we have had some kind of interesting support in terms of science to these athletes, especially because of Rio 2016. So we had a time with not a good investment, but with more investment in this field. But since it's over, because we've had this Olympics in 2016, since this is over, things are not organized. We don't see these investments anymore. So in terms of investment in science in Brazil, in sports sciences in Brazil, what I can say is that we don't have much investment as we've had in the past. So it gets complicated. And also in terms of the departments in the universities, we also have fewer investments. So I'm not talking only about federations and sportive associations, but also in terms of universities who could be helpful in this moment, but they're also facing these problems. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't know exactly what to expect, but I'm not optimistic because of the whole scenario, you know.
Yeah, this means a lot. I fully understand your point, and I think this is an issue that, although we do a really good sports science in general, as a Brazilian, however, there are things that are out of our control. Yes, but talking about one thing that we can control, and maybe you, Tabata, can control more than me, could you tell us a little bit about the ABRAPESP? Well, what is ABRAPESP? What it or she does or he does, and how is the point right now where you see as a president of ABRAPESP that you can tell, well, we have improved this in comparison to our past and so on. So could you give our audience a little bit more about the background of ABRAPESP?
Sure. This is the Brazilian Association of Sports Psychology, and it was founded during the 2000 and something. It's always because some people say 1 year and the others say another one, so I prefer to say that it's 2000 and something, because in Brazil we have sports psychology now is a part of is a specialization of the psychologist. Is one of the is recognized as a specialty of the psychologists, and it was since 2000. So in 2000 we have this this change in our code. I don't know how to say this in English, but we have a specific council of psychologists, and then they decided so. And from this time on, Professor Katia Rubio started with the ABRAPESP, so she's the main founder of the Brazilian Association of Sports Psychology, that understanding that we need to have an association to take care of this process, and understanding that it's a specific specialty. I know that it's not a reality in other countries, so it's important to say, to tell this story again, because it's part of the Brazilian way of doing sports psychology. But of course, we are very open to all the fields interested in sports sciences. So we have with us psychologists, professional sports scientists, and people from the physical education field, and some physiotherapists, and some physicians. So people interested in sports sciences are welcome in our association. And specifically from 2019 to now, because I started to be president in 2019. That was when we were elected as a new board. We have had a very important mission, which was to develop ABRAPESP in terms of communicate better with other fields, with the people who are member of our community, and also to develop a sort of globalization process. So it was, interestingly, it was before the pandemics, but with the pandemics, it got stronger. So we weren't expecting to do everything we did. It was faster because of the pandemics, because as everything was online, so we needed to improve our social media, our communication process virtually, and we've had the opportunity to meet people, as I met you, for example. So if it weren't the pandemics, I don't think we would be able to do everything we did the way we did. So it was interesting to see how things come up with the results.
Nice, nice. Yeah, I think this association has a lot of power and also has a lot of parts where she or he can increase. So I think this is the right way to do science. Just look in the eyes of people, make connections, and share the small knowledge that we have and make our field be stronger and help more people. Nice. Marius, I have a question for you related to the topic of our interview. How was your feeling when you were right there starting your first fight? Because as a handball player, I always remember this because, yeah, I have everything related to, oh, they were my friends and so, but this is a Mannschaft sport, so it's a team sport. How was your first feeling when you said, okay, fight, and then wrestling? So how was your feeling? Just because I want to know this from your perspective as a former wrestling athlete.
Yeah, so I have to say I've never been to big competitions or so it was never really a big thing. It was always a a thing I did next to my main life topics, so to speak. But and when it comes to that, I think I never had this kind of seriousness. I felt a lot of curiosity. I was pumped with adrenaline for sure, and but it was before I always put things down like, okay, you do your best, it will be enough, and whatever, and it doesn't really matter to you. You have all these other things you do, and but in the end, the process itself, I actually love it in a way that it's I was in a kind of it was not meditation in a way that it was calm, not at all, but it was kind of meditative in a way that it puts you out of your life framework, like out of your ordinary life framework into this situation. It forces you to be completely 100% in this situation. And this is irrespective of, also in the moment where it starts, you're there and you're immediately there. You do not want to get hit. You do not want to get thrown. You do not want to get, and you do your best and you go and you go and you go. And this kind of going forward mentality, I left it about these kinds of sports so much. This kind of pressure in this situation, pressure is really, really valuable. I have the feeling, in a way that it also puts you forward psychologically, and that you leave things aside which have been problematic until the moment where someone says, okay, now go hardcore, and that's really valuable. But until then, I was just, I mean, there seems to be a reason why I'm not a professional competitor. So first, I have my health problems, but second, and probably more important, I'm not in this. I never really got into this fight mode before. I was always more into, oh yeah, all people are the same, and it was a little ridiculous.
Nice to hear from your side. How was the feeling to start the fight? But Thabata, heading to the end, I want to ask you, what kind of advice could you give to young generation of sport scientists and sport psychologists for those working in the applied field? So based on your own experience, what kind of advice could you give to them?
Well, there's one thing I've learned, and I've learned it very late, I guess, but not too late because I'm doing this right now. That is, you can do what you like. You can do something that you're passionate with, and still you can do serious research on that. So it took a while for me to truly understand that. It's a tough path. It's not easy because when you do something that you love, sometimes you need to set some things aside to do a good research. But when you know how to recognize it, to see these problems and to try to balance it, I guess that researching becomes more fluid, becomes more, you do it in a smooth way. Because doing research is tough. We know it's tough. So when you do it in a rigid way, in a very rigid, yeah, that's the word. When you do it in a very rigid way, sometimes you won't do it properly. You can give up, you can be very stressed. Sometimes things won't go because you're not in the mood, you're not feeling excited about what you're doing. But on the other way around, as I said, if you're too excited, if you're too passionate, sometimes you can just go with the flow when it's difficult to step back sometimes and just see things differently to try to make it serious as it must be, as it should be. But it's possible. What I'm trying to say is that it's possible. So for me, it's very sad when I hear people saying that, oh, I would love to research that, but no one was researching this topic. And then I started to do another different thing, a very cold topic to me, just because people said so, people said it would be interesting. It's just sad for me, because for me, we are losing good researchers, because when you research something that you love, that you feel it's interesting, sometimes it's a very intuitive process. I guess I'm a very intuitive researcher sometimes. I don't know exactly what I'm doing, but I feel it's that way. And then I start to reflect on that. Okay, it's because this and that. And then we have to do this kind of step sometimes. You go there with your instinct, but I don't know if it's the proper word, but yeah, in a very intuitive way. But then we need to step back and to observe what we're doing, to reflect on that. So there's a way to do it. So I guess that would be my message.
Nice. Yeah. Thabata, thanks a lot. Marius, thanks a lot as well for your attendance. Have an amazing day and see you next week at Podium Cast.